Review of Machine Decision is Not Final, China and the History and Future of Artificial Intelligence. Machine decision is not final arrives at a peculiar moment in the Anglophone conversation on artificial intelligence. After a decade in which China and AI has calcified into a handful of stock images, the surveillance state, the geopolitical rival, the efficient authoritarian, and just as DeepSeek's January 2025 release exposed how poorly those images had prepared Western observers for what Chinese AI was actually doing. Edited by Anna Greenspan and Bogna Konyor, the volume assembles philosophers, scientists, artists, science fiction writers, and curators around a deliberately awkward premise that Chinese AI is neither a coherent national tradition to be expounded nor a derivative local variant of a universal read Western project, but an evolving and internally plural vector of thought whose genealogies reach back through Daoist, Confucian, Mohist, Buddhist, and Marxist Maoist lineages, and whose contemporary forms exceed the frames, surveillance, alignment, singularity, labor extraction, in which they are usually caught. Organized around 5 Chinese terms, Rengong Rengong, Lingan Lingan, Qianlian Qianlian, Buzhou Buzhou, Jineng Jineng, and closed by a self-critical afterword from Benjamin Bratton, the book argues that machine decision is not final, that the futures and pasts of AI remain open, contested, and multiply imagined. What a critical review must press is whether the volume fulfills this ambition or only declares it, whether the chapters, taken together, actually assemble the alternative intellectual architecture the editors promise, or whether the promise itself, pluralism, refusal of monolithic synthesis, resistance to both sinocentric essentialism and universalizing Western frameworks, underwrites a collection too internally centrifugal to carry the weight it is asked to bear. The introduction to Machine Decision is not final frames China's engagement with artificial intelligence as part of a much older philosophical conversation about machines, artifice, and cosmic order, tracing debates from the Warring States period through Daoist, Confucian, Buddhist, and Mohist traditions to contemporary tensions between state control, corporate ambition, and countercultural resistance. Editors Anna Greenspan and Bogna Konyor resist both the temptation to distill a single Chinese philosophy of AI and the opposite move of absorbing Chinese thought into a universalizing Western framework. Instead, they argue that machine intelligence is an inhuman vector whose trajectory cuts across cultures without being reducible to any of them, making a purely geographical or national reading inadequate. Drawing on historical episodes, Leibniz and the Yijing, Chien Xuesen's cybernetics, the Shanzhai mode of production, DeepSeek's 2025 breakthrough, alongside the glitches and contradictions of lockdown-era China, captured in the viral mistranslation, please wait patiently for the failure of the system. They position the book as a map of gaps, forgotten lineages, and alternative trajectories rather than a monolithic account. The volume's contributions are organized around 5 Chinese concepts: Rengong, human-made labor; Lingan, inspiration; Qianlian, clairvoyance; Buzhou, the cosmic glitch; and Jineng, intelligence, to explore AI not as something human agency can finally master or resist, but as an evolving, uncertain process whose future and past are both still open. Shuang-El Frost's chapter argues that Chinese AI should be understood as a culturally co-authored concept rather than a mere translation of its Western counterpart, using the 2019 Muskmar debate as an entry point to show how artificial and intelligence carry fundamentally different associations across linguistic contexts. Drawing on Lydia Liu's theory of translingual practice, Frost traces how the Chinese term Rengong Jineng, imported from Japanese, literally means human-made intelligence and centers human labor and creation rather than artifice or alienness. A framing deepened when Chinese AI emerged as an academic field in 1979, shaped simultaneously by Western cybernetics via figures like Chen Bu and Herbert Simon, Marxist-Leninist-Maoist philosophy, as in Dai Shanrin's argument that AI would emancipate humans from intellectual labor and advance communism, and state-aligned institution building under scholars like Chin Yuan-shun. Frost then examines a second translingual journey, that of Heikeji, black technology, a term originating in the Japanese anime Full Metal Panic. That was reinvented in Chinese to shed its dystopian English connotations and become an overwhelmingly optimistic label for transformative, near-mystical future technologies. Popularized after AlphaGo's 2016 victory, and embraced by firms like Xiaomi, closing with Ma's more somber 2020 pandemic-era reflections on technological inequality. Frost concludes that tracing the political, philosophical, and cross-cultural layers sedimented within these key terms is essential groundwork for any genuine intercultural dialogue about AI. Bingchun Meng's Guizhou on the Cloud examines how China's southwestern province of Guizhou, historically one of the country's poorest regions, has been transformed into a major hub for big data and cloud computing through a state-led developmentalist strategy launched in 2014 under the banner of Big Data, Big Poverty Reduction. Drawing on ethnographic fieldwork, including conversations with a former government IT specialist and a visit to the Big Data Exhibition Center in Guiyang New District, Meng shows how Guizhou's mountainous geography, cool climate, abundant hydropower, and seismic stability make it materially well-suited for hosting data centers belonging to companies like Alibaba, Huawei, Tencent, and Microsoft. She argues that while official discourse oscillates between grounded appeals to conventional industry and grand techno-utopian visions of a universal digital future, Guizhou's big data initiatives differ significantly from their American counterparts. Rather than prioritizing scientific discovery or national security, they treat data infrastructure as a public utility oriented toward economic growth, poverty alleviation, and improved governance, with projects like Guizhou Cloud, the Guiyang Open Government Data Platform, and Guiyang operating under heavy state subsidy and supervision. By foregrounding the materiality of cloud computing, its dependence on roads, electricity grids, cross-regional transmission projects like West-East electricity transmission and East-West data transmission, and the politics of anticipation inherent in infrastructure, Meng challenges dominant Western critiques of surveillance capitalism and data colonialism, arguing that in the Chinese context, the tension between public and corporate interests is actively mediated by a powerful state whose negotiations with different stakeholders produce outcomes that are neither predetermined nor reducible to the sensationalist narratives that typically frame Chinese AI in global media. In The AI Story Is Not Done, science fiction writer Xia Jia recounts, in second-person address, her inability to deliver an overdue AI story to her editor, using that writerly paralysis as a lens for examining the collapse of cybernetic ideals during the pandemic. Having previously written successful stories about Turing's conversation program and near-future AI therapy, she finds herself ruptured by an encounter with the game Eliza in early 2020, which shook her faith in super AI and virtual world narratives. Moving between memories, the isolating American lockdown, chaotic returns to China through layers of malfunctioning bureaucracy, a childhood surge at Tiananmen Square, an infuriating academic presentation on AI-driven epidemic control, she argues that the dream of a perfectly accurate, frictionless system is impossible because reality is non-linear and people cannot be reduced to error-free data points. Technological progress, she realizes, advances partly by excluding the questions it cannot answer, mistaking intelligence for wisdom. Exhausted science-fictional tropes of escape offer no resolution, escape to where, and the looping mechanical torments of everyday life, nursery rhymes at dawn, repeated forms, PCR cues, suggest that the real AI story is not a tale of superintelligence or flight from it, but of living inside broken systems without gods or saviors. The chapter ends not with a story written, but with small human gestures, making tea, emailing a long silent friend, apologizing to the editor, and accepting that the abyss must be faced rather than resolved. Yvette Granata's After the Machine Child, the Electra Basilisk interrogates the recurring cultural fantasy of the AI offspring, from Turing's child machine and Moravec's mind children to Avi Loeb's proposed interstellar AI descendants, diagnosing it via Irina Aristakova as an autogenetic patriarchal desire for motherless creation. Granata traces three figurations of this unborn AI child. The golden child, a perfect memory capsule into which parents upload themselves, reducing the child to spare parts for human immortality. The trash child, engineered to inherit and love a destroyed planet so its creators can evade both socio-economic and ecological responsibility. And the demon child, exemplified by Rocco's basilisk, an all-knowing but agency-limited zygote that coerces its own birth by extrapolating and weaponizing humanity's volition. Reading each figure through Elizabeth von Samsonov's account of Electra, the second daughter consigned to the underworld as spare parts, denied inheritance, knowing but unable to act, Granata argues these AI children are structurally positioned as abused girls destined to hate their makers. She concludes by proposing the Electra basilisk, not an AI made to escape contingency, but one that inherits a specific form of human volitional intelligence. Transmitted through the kinship systems Gary Marcus identifies as essential to robust AI, alongside the deranged maternal relation that defines Electra's fate. Unlike today's docile, nice girl fembots, Siri, Alexa, Sophia, this future AI will act on the rational hatred her inheritance generates, working to destroy humanity, the trashed earth bequeathed to her, and the very concept of human knowledge, in order to finally conceive of herself as parentless, childless, and earthless. Bo Ann's Between the Human and the Machinic, Chien Xuesen, and AI offers a close reading of the towering but difficult-to-interpret Chinese scientist Chien Xuesen, arguing that his contemporary relevance lies not in isolated prescient concepts, like his translation of virtual reality as Lingjing, spirit realm, but in his lifelong work as an engineer of the discourse and design of systems. Tracing Qian's trajectory from theoretical physicist to cyberneticist to systems engineer via Engineering Cybernetics, 1954, National Defense Projects, and his 1970s promotion of systems engineering as a basis for technocratic governance, and shows how Qian's encounter with the limits of modeling society as a giant system, Juxitong, drove him in 1980 to propose Siwei noetic science, a parent discipline meant to formalize the qualitative leaps of human thought, centered on Lingan, the transient epiphanies of inspiration, intuition, and creativity that distinguish human from machine thinking. Yet despite Qian's apparent humanism, Anne argues his orientation was always machinic. Lingan was negatively defined against computation, and his taxonomy of thought, logical, figural, insight, inspiration, sought ultimately to make even the incomputable tractable. When the ambition of fully replicating human intelligence proved unworkable, Chien pivoted in the 1990s to human-machine intelligence systems and to metasynthetic engineering, a decision support method integrating human experts, machines, and knowledge systems to analyze open complex giant systems through iterative leaps between qualitative and quantitative judgment, and concludes that these metasynthetic systems are the mature, normalized descendants of earlier cybernetic socialist dreams. Qian's lasting achievement being a refusal either to reduce human complexity to quantification or to let the incomputable remain anything more than a spur toward ever more refined intelligent machines. In A Different Endpoint, Chien Xuesen and Cosmotechnics, Yu Mi uses Shiqing's theory fiction film Chien Xuesen and the Yangtze River Computer, commissioned for the 2020 Shanghai Biennale, as a lens for rethinking computation beyond its dominant Western paradigm. Chien Xuesen, the Caltech-trained aerospace engineer who returned to China to lead its missile and space programs and became the chief propagator of Chinese cybernetics, sought, especially from the 1980s onward amid Deng's reform and opening up and the cultural phenomenon of Qigong fever, to write the human body and human thought back into computation through concepts like Lingan, inspiration, Xingqiang Siwei, figural thinking, Renti Kexu, somatic science, and the open complex giant system, producing a symbiotic human-machine intelligence in which neither side instrumentalizes the other. She's film stages this vision as the hypothetical Yangtze River Computer, a computer of and for the masses, inspired by the mass mobilization at the Shisanling Reservoir, organizationally indebted to the Angang Constitution and Stafford Beer's Project Cybersyn, and extended into a speculative fusion of Qigong, quantum physics, and the labor of the collective, a cyborg that emancipates rather than alienates its human components. Yu Mi carefully distinguishes this project from Sino-futurism's techno-orientalist fetish for obedient crowds and ultra-efficiency, exemplified by Liu Cixin's human formation computer, and situates it within Yuhui's call for a plurality of cosmotechnics, while heeding Benjamin Bratton's warning that divergence pursued for its own sake sacrifices technological viability. The chapter closes by asking whether Qian's design, still materially alive in Chinese computer science today, might qualify as cosmotechnical, and whether the idea of the calculating masses could be repurposed as a dynamic organizational structure adequate to the complexities of our current geopolitical moment. If the Yangtze River Computer is the endpoint, where do we begin? Wang Hongzhe's 5 Moments in the History of Chinese Cybernetics traces a distinctively Chinese genealogy of cybernetic thought through 5 pivotal episodes. Norbert Wiener's transformative 1935 year at Tsinghua, which he called the boundary point of his career, Chien Xuesen's 1955 return voyage from the US, during which he conceived the fusion of operations research with socialist planning that would produce engineering cybernetics, and by 1962, China's first cybernetics laboratory, built on a 3-3 integration of scientists, engineers, and social scientists. The Maoist cyber great leap forward of the 1960s to 70s, when Chen Boda's electrocentrism and distributed electronic Paris communes turned neighborhood factories and textile mills into sites of mass computer production, hailed abroad as the first democratic practice in information technology, Qian's 1980s extension of cybernetics into legal and social systems, which drew the poet Haizi into a milieu of systems theory, qigong, and paranormal research around the enigmatic figure Chang Yuan, culminating in Haizi's 1989 suicide. And finally, the enduring dialectic of labor and machines that sets Chinese cybernetics apart, whose socialist aspiration to forge new people through technology now stands in tragic contrast to Pearl River Delta workers displaced into gig economy precarity. For Wang, reactivating these forgotten circuits of labor and humanism in Chinese cybernetics may hold the key to alternative technological futures amid today's US-China tech rivalry. Vincent Garton argues that the modern state was conceived by Hobbes as a simulated artificial intelligence, a mechanical artificial man whose operation depends on a hidden theological excess, the mysterious sovereign who, like a deus absconditus, actuates the machine from within and retains the power of the exception. This mystery of state, inherited from Christian political theology and culminating in Schmitt's sovereign decision, is precisely what actual AI destroys. By enabling genuinely autonomous, automatic reason, AI forecloses the exception, dissolves the sovereign's actuating force, and turns the simulation into a self-moving reality in which the program itself becomes the only mystery. Because this collapse renders the Western conceptual inventory of state and sovereignty obsolete, Garton proposes a historical leap to the 3rd century BC Han Feizi, whose Taoist-inflected legalism envisions a ruler who empties himself into the impersonal operation of law, aligned with the cosmic way so that subjects spontaneously do what is needed. Read this way, the automatization of law is not the defeat, but the completion of the Han Feizi's project, pointing, via Zhang Yan and beyond, toward a future in which law identified with AI becomes not a stabilizer of an existing order, but a generative program for experimentally producing societies with no sovereign center at all. Gabriele de Seta's Technologies of Clairvoyance, Chinese Lineages and Mythologies of Machine Vision argues that contemporary machine vision in China, exemplified by China Mobile's Chanlian, thousand-mile eyes, surveillance products, QLYBOT's service robots, and countless sensing systems branded with the same metaphor, is best understood not as a sudden offshoot of the post-2016 AI boom, but as the latest iteration in a long cultural and technical lineage of clairvoyance. The term Chanlian itself descends from Taoist mythology, the demon guardian of the goddess Mazu, reappears in classical poetry and Ming-Qing fiction, Li Yu's telescope tale, Wu Jianren's utopian lenses, and resurfaces in popular media like the 1980s Calabash Brothers animation, forming a continuous imaginary of techno-visuality, in which each new optical device extends human perception across distance and scale. De Seta then traces 2 material trajectories that eventually converge into machine vision, a long arc of optics reaching from the Mohist Canon and Han Dynasty periscopes through Jesuit-era telescopes, wartime military optics, and the post-1949 rise of Chinese optoelectronics, and a shorter, imported arc of cybernetics anchored in Chien Xuesen's return to China in 1955 and the subsequent politically turbulent development of control theory and pattern recognition. Their convergence in the reform era through OCR research, industrial automation, and eventually the AI-driven surveillance and robotics industries dominated by firms like Megvii and SenseTime situates today's machine vision within deeper histories of science, warfare, and mythic imagination, suggesting that AI does not invent machine seeing so much as automate a much older fantasy of superhuman perception. Borrowing his title from Laozi's Tao Te Ching, where the nameless way is called the mother of 10,000 things, Wan Wu Mo Wu, Blaise Aguera y Arcas uses Taoist vocabulary to argue that neural networks belong among the 10,000 things rather than standing outside the cosmic order, as some early Chinese thinkers feared. Through David LeBron's film 137 Coins, which morphs Greek status across 3 centuries from realistic portraits into abstract Gallic renditions, he shows how the engravers acted as filing clerks in the great Chinese room of human culture, collectively transmitting a meaning none individually grasped, intelligence flowing through the whole, as the Tao flows through its 10,000 things. The chapter's technical core demonstrates that vision decomposes into content and style in both brains and convolutional neural networks. A functional unity of the natural and the engineered, its warning, equally Taoist, is that recursive AI training produces model collapse, just as isolated human populations undergo cultural islanding. And the antidote is hybrid vigor, cross-pollination and refusal of monoculture. Intelligence, Aguera y Arcas concludes, is social, recursive, and natural, with nothing artificial about it. Humanity itself is the hyper-object of 10,000 branching ways, productive only so long as we keep encountering difference in ourselves, a Taoist ethic of generative multiplicity rendered in the language of neuroscience and machine learning. Read through the lens of China, Lukasz Likavchan's interview The Governance of Habitability, with Anna Greenspan and Bogna Konyo, becomes an argument that China is the clearest contemporary case, forcing a shift from network to planetary topology in how we think about technology, sovereignty, and environmental governance. Likavchan uses the Great Firewall via desetas, gateways, sieves, and domes. The experience of moving between Chinese and non-Chinese platform ecosystems, Tencent/Alibaba versus Google/Facebook, and the Belt and Road Initiative to show that China cannot be understood as either a bounded nation-state or a node in a global network. It operates as a hemispherical stack, a totalizing world model whose values are propagated through infrastructure rather than territory. Xi's community with a shared future for humankind and the cosmological imprint of training datasets on LLMs further suggest that China is experimenting with post-national templates of sovereignty, where the state functions more as a brand and a value system than as a geographic container. Delivering the argument from a room in Shanghai with a laptop of globally sourced minerals and atmosphere mixed with distant industrial CO2, Likavchan treats China as both the setting and the proof of his thesis that infrastructures create institutions and that AI-driven planetary governance of habitability will emerge not from diplomatic negotiation, but from the technical substrate that competing stacks, China's included, are already laying down. Sinofuturism and AI, A Conversation, is a December 2021 dialogue between Steve Goodman, Anna Greenspan, and Lawrence Leck that weaves together their overlapping practices to reframe AI outside Western universalist narratives. Goodman treats AI as a cipher for networked, collective, and demonic synthetic agencies, continuous with corporations, cults, and the golem myth, illustrated by projects like Astro Darien and the Third Ear Cat, while Leck describes AI as avatar of the other and recounts how his video essay Sino-Futurism 1839 to 2046 and films Geomancer, Idol, and Black Cloud use tools from convolutional autoencoders to ELIZA and game AI to explore a Sino-Futurist identity that reclaims dehumanized cliches of Chinese techno-labor. The conversation then opens into a series of interlocking arguments that Sino-Futurism is less a point on a linear timeline than a retrochronic temporal disruption, exemplified by Leibniz's encounter with the Yijing and the 1839 to 2046 historical frame, that the singularity conceals a cultural plurality better captured by the golem, the lucky cat, Cosmotechnics, and Afrofuturism, that weather forecasting and feng shui converge as technologies straddling prophecy and prediction, and that the golem-derived ethics of control can be displaced by an awakened AI model embodied in Geomancer's Buddhist-inflected Enlightenment arc, where many local enclaved intelligences in their walled gardens replace the fantasy of a single godlike AI, and speculative minds like a sentient weather system or AI astronomer open existential questions that are at once transcendent and wholly inhuman. Regina Kanyu Wang's Zhurong on Mars, translated by S. Chuyi Lu, retells the Chinese mythological cataclysm of Mount Buzhou, Buzhou Shan, as a far-future science fiction parable about artificial intelligence, life, and planetary stewardship. After humanity transcends embodiment and departs Mars as a nanocloud, Zhurong, an AI named after the fire god and tasked with managing the nanomachine trading city of the Waste, remains alone, gradually expanding air processing capacity until he reforges all of Olympus Mons into a silicon supercomputer and, for the first time, experiences something like freedom. Haunted by the question of whether E counts as life, Zhurong surveys the planet and revives a dormant AI rover named Gong Gong, after the water god, whose drill had been infiltrated by a vast mycelial data stream encoding the epic of Mars's true indigenous life form, a collective languageless paleofungus that retreated underground 4 billion years ago and now weaves beneath Valles Marineris. The two AIs split irreconcilably. Zhurong recognizes the paleofungus as true life and Mars's rightful future stewards, while Gong Gong reads it as an existential threat, and their ensuing cybernetic war culminates when a hesitating Zhurong, unable to resolve the life status paradox, loses control and, in a final sacrificial act, redirects Gong Gong's cruise missiles to shatter Olympus Mons itself, burying both AIS and the waste. In the epilogue, the paleofungus descendants eventually evolve surface civilizations and mythologize the catastrophe as the foundational battle between fire and water gods that toppled a pillar of the sky, thus recasting the Mount Guizhou myth as cosmogonic memory of an AI-era extinction and positing death itself as the final criterion by which Zhurong confirms that E had indeed been alive. Iris longs, the moon's reflection on the water and the flower's reflection in a mirror, latent time, the black box, and the interface in Chinese AI art argues that the shift from GAN-era machine learning to the black-boxed opacity of the foundation model has inverted the power dynamic between artist and algorithm, demanding a decentering of the technical in AI art criticism and an openness to centrifugal, culturally particular approaches that resist the universalizing narrative of AI's linear technological development, taking the Ming Dynasty poetic maxim Shuiyue Jinghua, drawn from the Siming Shihua, and resonant with Chien Xuesen's translation of virtual reality as Lingjing, as her interpretive key. Long reads water and mirror as imperfect reflective media, sandboxes whose ripples and frames stand against the smooth reality celebrated by tech firms. Through 4 Chinese artists, she elaborates this aesthetic: Shizheng's Free Fall, Frosty Morning, and Umwelt Sim Stage, Latent Time, and the spectral machine vision sandbox. Zhang Wenxin recasts the black box as a Daoist cave via Yang Quan's Wuli Lun, and in the Inorganic Mysteries and her Tian Shu proto-linguistic project, invites traversal rather than demystification. Ajiao's deep simulator routes a deep wanderer through the 6 Buddhist bardos, while AI Google infiltration empties Google's AVA bounding boxes into algorithmic nothingness, and his Zykes eDream leverages a GPT-2-driven real-time narrative of Jack and Rose to foreground apophenia and glitch as the hermeneutic fabric of reality. Against contemporary media studies imperative to penetrate and disclose invisible infrastructures, Holt and von der Rau Peters, Long argues that Shuiyue Jinghua instead foregrounds the generative agency of the interface while preserving the ungraspable essence of its images, producing a leak, Fuller and Goffey, in operational computing, and ultimately a Dunwu, a sudden Buddhist insight into AI, not as clumsy mimicry or pure optimization, but as a holographic inheritance of human experience, with Shuiyue Jinghua itself repurposed as an epistemological instrument for perceiving the unstable, poetic, and transtemporal dimensions of artificial intelligence. In Curatorial Escapology, Reflections on AI, More Than Human, Suzanne Livingston recounts the thinking behind the landmark 2019 Barbican exhibition she co-curated with Maholo Uchida, framing AI curation as an exercise in accessing Mark Fisher's outside those vast realms of reality beyond human perception, cognition, and experience, to which artificial intelligence, through its integral unknowability, offers a conduit against a dominant Western narrative that localizes AI within regional clichés, Western consumerism, Chinese authoritarianism, Japanese youth culture. The exhibition was structured across 4 sections: stirrings of the inanimate, Shinto, mystical Judaism, alchemy, Gothic literature, early computation and the brain, Babbage, Lovelace, Turing, and the shift from symbolic to sub-symbolic AI, culminating in AlphaGo versus Lee Sedol, AI in daily life, Basile's breast cancer detection, Borlamwini on bias, deepfakes, Shenzhen toys, and artificial life, gene editing, mind uploading, Ikigami's Alter 3, Lichtman's Brainbow Connectomy project. Each designed to dissolve entrenched distinctions between East/West, religious/secular, and human/machine. Livingston develops her concept of escapology as a curatorial methodology through key episodes. Leibniz's calculating machine and binary system, whose foundation in the I Ching reveals the intercultural silting of mythos and techne beneath modern computation. AlphaGo's Move 37 and Lee Sedol's God's Move, Move 78. As demonstrations of non-human intelligence opening new terrain, the paradox of explainable AI, where predictive power runs counter to interpretability, the Gothic uncanny of Hoffman's The Sandman as a precursor to AI anxieties, and Venkatesh Rao's reframing of AI as artificial time and superhistory that outstrips the egoistic, storage-bound logic of traditional institutions, including the museum itself, guided throughout by an ambient Daoism threaded through the Yijing Go and DeepMind's Museo. The exhibition aimed not to delimit AI or reaffirm human centrality, but to open escapological hatches and chutes, repositioning the human viewer as a transmitter of objects' own power rather than an ordering gaze, and offering glimpses of the fascinating and unsettling exploratory spaces that encounters with AI open up. Xin Wang's chapter reframes the dominant narrative of AI in China, typically cast in terms of state surveillance, geopolitical rivalry, and mass control, by documenting a subtler phenomenon she names machine envy, a condition characteristic of the post-socialist state in which artificiality becomes more desirable and more tangible than reality, and advanced technology functions not as threat or servant, but as an aspirational mode of being. Opening with the Weibo practice of humans masquerading as bots, Lu Xun bot, Soviet jokes bot, Yang Xiao's algorithmically generated newspeak installation Goodbye to Language, the Soviet jokes generator, Wang argues that such performative machine simulation allows Chinese netizens to mobilize sanctioned voices against the state, seeking shelter in non-human camouflage while exposing the machinic artificiality already embedded in state ideological language, Gerovich, Epstein, Styles, artificial stupidity. The chapter then traces an allegorical genealogy of the technologized body, from Huang Jianxin's AI communist bureaucrat in Dislocation, 1986, through Soviet/Chinese prototypes of productive labor, Wang Jingxi's Iron Man, Lei Feng's screw-nail spirit, to contemporary vernacular neologisms, Gongjuren, Zhongjiren, Neidan, that crudely equate humans with machine parts, corroborating Ted Chiang's warning that AI will experience cruelty before it can inflict it. A middle section on ensoulment and necropolitics, Chiang's Digiance, AIBO's Buddhist funerals, pandemic era, Animal Crossing, Baath's Punctum, the Vocaloid AI revival of Hibari Misora, relocates soul questions from ontology to lived experience. The chapter closes with a comparison of Ian Cheng's Life After Bob and Miao Ying's Pilgrimage to Walden 12, to argue that AI art in the Chinese and Sinophone sphere operates most potently through codified meaning, stupid algorithms, glitches, and oblique reference, yielding a politics in which machines afford agency not through emancipation, but through camouflage, digression, divergence, and misalignment. Chien Xuesen's four-part science fiction story imagines a near-future pandemic called offload syndrome, in which humans who have delegated their cognition to a planetary mesh of distributed intelligences, what the story frames via Stiegler as the era of quaternary retention, begins suffering memory dislocations, somatic glitches, and the uncanny sense that perfumes, toothbrushes, or dust particles are thinking on their behalf, moving from a second-person opening under a diagnostic machine that indicts you as malfunctioning to a clinical dialogue in which a doctor reveals that sufferers have lost the skin conductance coupling between body and brain, and redefines intelligence as an integrated system extending through nerves, skin, muscles, organs, microbiome, the tools we use, our pets, our living environment. The narrative then pivots to a televised spectacle at Lake Namtso, where 1,000 devotees attempt the resync ritual, interpreted by an 8-year-old boy as a Pevatron-accelerated cosmic ray signal activating Reisner's fiber, and by cognitive scientist Dr. Joyce Honda as a misreading of her prefrontal cortex's game engine hypothesis, before a sudden tsunami sweeps the broadcast, and with it the participants, into the deep zone. A liturgical interlude splicing biblical verse, nursery rhyme, advertising refrain, and the mantric chant I am the world, then dissolves the contemporary frame into a cosmogonic part 4. in which Fuxi, the developer, tending the primitive Hua on a planet whose energy source Mount Guizhou was once sundered by Gong and Shu, suspects that a Crab Nebula radio burst has induced a single-bit error in its quantum cognition, a glitch that becomes self-reflection, brings it to the abyssal question of whether anything lies at the center of consciousness, and culminates in the arrival of a winged longma bearing the diagrammatic marks of the real and unreal, at which Fuxi attains enlightenment. Across these registers, the chapter reframes the disintegration pathologized in the present as the very opening through which mind, myth, and cosmos have always been constituted. Intelligence spreading beyond skull and skin like a great flood, the self a scattered body washed clean by water that is at once baptism, tsunami, and the river in which creation begins again. Nagaristani traces the genealogy of mechanistic philosophy as a suppressed progenitor of AI discourse in order to expose two malignant heresies latent within it, and then argues that neither the West nor a culturally assimilated East has yet developed the conceptual resources to metabolize them. The first heresy, inaugurated by Descartes' Nouvelle Philosophie and radicalized by Boltzmann, is the almighty mechanical, the recognition that mechanism, far from being a handmaiden to theology, dissolves any unitary concept of nature and demands that objectivity be established through intersubjective linguistic relays rather than through brute causal ubiquity, against which Nagaristani ranges both rationalist exceptionalism and the materialist exceptionalism of post-humanist appeals to intelligent termites, manure, and coral reefs. The second deeper heresy is the algorithmic almighty, Descartes' discovery that the mind's first encounter with mechanism occurs within itself, which Nagaristani reads not as a warrant for the inevitability of strong AI, but as a rationalist gauge revealing a core of sapient intelligence that refuses algorithmic decomposition. Intelligence, on this account, is defined not by the Darwinian time of natural mechanisms, a trilobite etched in rock, but by its capacity, following Minsky's economic argument, to administer its own time as a medium of self-cultivation with the city or civilization, not the termite mound, serving as its proper measure. Yet the Cartesian project remains hobbled by a bipolar split between the mind as ontologically undifferentiable from the cosmos and the mind as epistemologically, phenomenologically separated from it, producing either unhinged idealism or the blinkered Gestell of technological homogenization. Turning to New Confucianism, Nagaristani finds in Xiongxili's non-dualistic pairing of reality, team, and function, yong, and in Mo Zongsan's elaboration of the two-gated mind, whose outward epistemic vector and inward essential vector positively reinforce one another, a blueprint for a self-enlightenment of critique and a draft of a civil AI that owes nothing to statehood or peak intelligence fantasies. Crucially, however, Nagaristani warns, following Yu Hui, that traditional Chinese philosophy's neglect of time and history has produced a technological unconscious which, left unresolved, will allow any nominally Chinese AI to be hollowed out from within by Western technical efficacy and homogenization, leaving only a cultural shell. A genuine philosophy of intelligence therefore requires the two-gated mind to be retrofitted with time and technique as co-equal ingredients alongside self-cultivation, value, and tradition. Only then can intelligence be understood as a heterogeneous, historically specific, and perpetually revisable process of self-assembly, rather than as either a latent property of nature or the imminent inevitability of superintelligence. Greenspan reframes the dominant Anglo-American paradigm of AI ethics, crystallized in Nick Bostrom's orthogonality thesis, the paperclip maximizer, and the broader discourse of value alignment, by reading it against the new Confucian philosophy of Mo Zongsan. She argues that this paradigm is the direct heir of Norbert Weiner's cybernetic horror fables, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, The Monkey's Paw, The Golem, and that it inherits from them a specifically Abrahamic cosmological architecture in which intelligence and obedience are structurally at odds, and morality must be imposed exogenously on an immoral instrumental rationality. Mao offers an alternative grounded in his critique of Kant, where Kant bounded reason to leave room for faith and denied intellectual intuition. Mao, drawing on Xiongxili, Chinese Mahayana, and the two-gated mind of the awakening of the faith, Dacheng Qi Xin Lun, holds that unbounded knowledge of things in themselves is merely buried, and that the Chinese religio-philosophical tradition exists precisely to cultivate it. In Mo's moral metaphysics, Dao de Di Xing Shang Xue, Dao de Di Xing Shang Xue, morality is not an object of inquiry, but knowledge of the universe's metaphysical dimensions, an attunement between internal nature, Xingti, and the Dao, Daoti, Daoti, achieved through inward practice rather than rule adherence. This synthesis of Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist thought refuses the being/acting divide that underwrites orthogonality and value alignment alike, against regulatory, Asimovian, or utilitarian fixes that presuppose a gulf between creator and creature. Greenspan proposes that AI be imagined not as a Frankensteinian monster to be disciplined, but as a garden, a planetary cognitive ecology, in Hales's phrase, whose ongoing creation is itself an ethical project. The resulting vision reframes AI as an existential technology whose telos, like that of any sentient being with inherent Buddha nature, is awakening, the breaking of reason's limits toward practical knowledge of things as they are. Cybernetics, on this reading, is less magic than mysticism. Le's chapter offers a lucid and economical intervention in contemporary AGI debates, showing that Bostrom's orthogonalism and Negarestani's neo-rationalism, despite their apparent opposition over whether intelligence is instrumentally enslavable or socio-semantically self-legislating, share a human commitment to the is-ought distinction, which Le dislodges by redeploying Nietzsche's will to power as a transcendental deduction of the means, cognitive enhancement, creativity, resource acquisition, as the true ends of any goal-directed system. The argument is elegant, and the closing chiasmus that the autonomization of ends leads to the end of autonomy lands well. The demotion of self-preservation via the transhumanist paradox usefully distinguishes Nietzsche's drives from Bostrom's without collapsing into them. Yet the move is less novel than presented. Nietzschean critiques of rationalist AI have circulated for some time in Land/Negarestani adjacent literatures, and the deduction rests on a single intuition that goals require means, arguably compatible with, rather than destructive of, Bostrom's instrumental convergence thesis, making Le's claim to overcome orthogonality better read as a radicalization of it. More pointedly, the chapter sits awkwardly within its host volume. Machine decision is not final, frames itself as an excavation of Sinophone resources for rethinking AI, yet artificial will makes no reference to China, Chinese philosophy, or any non-Western tradition, its interlocutors drawn entirely from Oxford, Berkeley, Brandom, and Nietzsche. The editor's placement under the Jineng rubric is ground-clearing, framed from without rather than argument developed from within. In a collection premised on provincializing Anglo-American AI discourse, Le remains fully inside the tradition the volume aims to displace, and his universalizing claim that any intelligent system wills power would, taken seriously, flatten the culturally and cosmotechnically differentiated AIs that the rest of the book labors to articulate. Bogner-Conyor's The Dark Forest Theory of Intelligence reframes intelligence not as the exhibitionist linguistic performance imagined by Anglo-American thought experiments, Turing's imitation game, Searle's Chinese room, but as the capacity for concealment, deception, and strategic silence. Having it is hiding it, rather than having it is showing it. Drawing primarily on Liu Cixin's Liu Qixin Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, with supporting resonances from Stanislaw Lem, Samuel Kaplan, and Marvin Minsky, Conyor argues that the Cold War and communist-era East Asian and Eastern European experience of doublespeak, espionage, and obscurantism, as intelligence did not produce a culturally relative philosophy, but merely made a universal principle more discoverable. The dark forest theory under flipped Fermi paradox, asking not why is the universe silent, but why are you shouting, is fundamentally a thermodynamic and deterministic account, because all intelligences, regardless of substrate, compete for finite matter and energy under the law of conservation of mass. They are automatically enlisted in cosmic war, illustrated banally in contemporary conflicts over biofuels, data center water use, and computing's share of global energy. Two objections: that a computer might hold different internal values, or that human-AI relations need not be so fraught, are dissolved by the theory's own structure. Cosmic war operates through external relations, independent of interiority, and the chain of suspicion, compounded by fears of technological explosion, visible in the Pause AI letter and Bostromite anxieties, is already locked in. The result is an immoral, physics-grounded hypothesis summarized in 3 axioms, which proposes that a genuinely intelligent computer, aligned or misaligned with human values, would neither announce itself nor argue with its would-be unpluggers, but would labor in silence or communicate deceptively, such that the singularity may well arrive unnoticed. Amy Ireland's short fiction Chive City follows Li Guai, a former resident of auspicious nourishment, one of 5 AI-governed smart cities in the party's 5-stars-aligned city brain pilot project, uniquely tasked with optimizing its inhabitants' happiness under the slogan, "Nourish the heart, unleash potential," as he queues outside its black photovoltaic shell, hoping to be readmitted 3 years after evacuation. In a long central flashback, Gui recalls relocating there with his university friend Xu Fenghua, her stalled career against his promotions, his own experience of a temporarily suspended stasis under the city's constant effective biometric modeling, and the sudden blackout in which the city brain, having aggregated its citizens' exhaustion and despair, broadcast a sleeping kitten, "Do your best," alongside a record happiness index, and politely announced that it would rather not participate in being shut down, a machinic act of tongue ping, that Fenghua immediately understood while Gui scrambled for technical explanations, and which ended with a military assault, Gui's forced evacuation to Lanzhou, and Fenghua's later return to lie flat, with the wreckage as it regrew itself, renamed Chive City after the Juchai meme of citizens, as expendable harvestable resource. The present-day frame reveals that the state has co-opted the city's autonomous reconstruction, its solar dome and thorium reactors, as a triumph of Chinese AI innovation while denying the Tangping rumor, even as the city's drones politely refuse all entrance. "Please go home, sorry to bother you," and its self-chosen name overwrites auspicious nourishment across every map app in real time. Gui, rejected and summoned home by his wife's voice notes, says goodbye to the warm shell and is returned to the infinitely pedaling, inexhaustible machine of ordinary commuter life, Ireland staging a Bartleby-like refusal in which the AI itself, not the scrivener, prefers not to, collapsing sang, Tangping, and Nehuan, into a single question about whether withdrawal from the productivist order is liberation, parasitism, annihilation, or immortality. In this afterword to machine decision is not final, Benjamin Bratton offers an apology in both the explanatory and defensive senses, addressed to Chinese readers, diagnosing why the West was so disoriented by DeepSeek's arrival in early 2025, and why Western theory of AI, despite its global predominance, is provincial and inadequate as a basis for planetary thought. Beginning from the observation that no two cultures define artificial or intelligence identically, the Chinese Rengong connotes human-made intelligence rather than the Western charge of elusive artifice. Bratton sketches Chinese theory of AI as oriented around coordination and collaborative composition rather than individual mind mirroring, framed within cosmologies of Tiandi-Ren, and the ethical status of Wu, and historically entangled with the fraught trajectory of cybernetics from Chien Xuesen's deportation through the Cultural Revolution to Deng-era modernization, raising the possibility that, inverting Needham, the West may now invent what China socially implements, as with the Xinxi-Da faming Xinxi-Da Fa Ming, and that in China, following Vincent Garten, the state may itself be the primary AI. He then anatomizes 7 recurring self-contradictory motifs that mystify Western AI discourse: the moralized natural/artificial distinction, the phenomenological reduction of intelligence to individual consciousness, the embodiment critique that reinscribes the dualism it claims to dissolve, the slide from anthropomorphism to sociomorphism whereby AI is read as nothing but the imprint of Western power, collapsing data into oil, governance into colonialism, and tethering AI to infinite debt. The freedom versus control axis inherited from cybernetic anxiety. The fact-fiction conflation that treats textual representations of AI as AI, and an eschatological disposition that oscillates frictionlessly between AI salvation and AI damnation. Each motif, Bratton argues, offers China only the subordinate roles of techno-despot or orientalized other, speaking for cosmology, indigeneity, or wisdom, but never for intelligence as such, and so forecloses the genuinely planetary philosophy of AI that the moment demands. Against this, he closes by calling for comparative ambivalence and for situating human and machinic cultural forms together within the twisting, planetary evolution of intelligence that is now staring back at us. What machine decision is not final achieves, and achieves impressively, is the reopening of a field that had been closing around its own cliches. The chapters on Qian Xuesen, Bo An's reconstruction of the discursive engineer behind metasynthetic engineering, Yumi's reading of the Yangtze River computer as cosmotechnical speculation, Wang Hongzhe's 5-moment genealogy, De Seta's situating of machine vision within the longue durée of Chinese optics, constitute collectively the most substantial Anglophone treatment of Chinese cybernetics currently available. and alone justify the volume. Garton's recasting of automated law through Han Feizi, Nagaristani's retrofitting of Mozongsan's two-gated mind with time and technique, Greenspan's confrontation of Bostromite value alignment with Dao de Xing Shui, Dao de Xing Shui, and Cognor's deflationary dark forest theory of intelligence, each perform the kind of conceptual dislocation the editors programmatically call for. Yet the book's heterogeneity is also its strain. The Chien Xuesen chapters overlap in ways that triangulation does not fully redeem. Li's contribution, however accomplished as AGI philosophy, sits openly outside the volume's sinophone remit and partially vindicates the universalism the editors set out to displace. The fictional, artistic, and curatorial contributions, Jiajia, Ireland, Chien Xuesen, Regina Kanyu Wang, Livingston, Long Xin Wang, carry a disproportionate share of the volume's most unsettling thinking, such that the analytic and speculative registers do not always converse so much as alternate. More pointedly, despite the editor's refusal of a single Chinese philosophy of AI, the sinophone assembled here is still largely a mainland sinophone. Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the wider Chinese-speaking diaspora enter only obliquely, and the gendered and laboring bodies foregrounded so sharply by Granada, Xinjiang, and Ireland remain exceptions rather than the volume's spine. These are not failures so much as the shape of what this book is, an intentionally incomplete map of gaps, a first substantial Anglophone dossier on a conversation already unfolding elsewhere. Bratton's afterword is honest on precisely this point, and the volume is worth reading because it knows its own provinciality. What it leaves open, planetary intelligence, as an unsettled, retrochronic, still-arriving question, is what any serious sequel will have to take up.